Have you ever looked at the world around you and felt, deep down, that something is terribly wrong? That the chaos is too constant, the suffering too widespread, the cruelty too deeply woven into human life to be called random? Every day brings another political collapse, another economic shock, another social fracture, another environmental disaster. And after a while, it starts to feel less like history is unfolding naturally and more like something in the design itself is broken. But what if that feeling is not paranoia and not pessimism, but the echo of a hidden truth that was once known? Long before official Christianity hardened into doctrine, there were early Christians who told a very different story about why this world became so dark, a story so strange, so dangerous, and so forbidden that the early church did not merely reject it, but tried to erase it. Their writings were burned, buried, condemned, and pushed out of history because they told a version of creation that made the world look less like a perfect divine order and more like a prison built on ignorance and deception. For centuries, that lost story seemed to vanish completely, as if it had been successfully destroyed forever. But then, in one of history's strangest reversals, a large body of those forgotten texts was found discarded in the dust, thrown away like garbage, hidden in the last place anyone would think to look. They were fragmented, inconsistent, and often mysterious, but they carried the remains of a worldview the authorities wanted gone. And with a little patience, a little speculation, and a willingness to follow the trail into forbidden territory, that buried story can finally be told again. If there is a wound hidden beneath ordinary life, it may be this: the feeling that the world around you is not entirely what it pretends to be, that behind the noise of history and the weight of the visible world, there is a deeper fracture, older than memory, older than language, perhaps as old as creation itself. In the ancient Gnostic imagination, existence did not begin in confusion, violence, or lack. It began in fullness. Before matter, before time, before distance, before bodies and names and fear, there was only the One, the Father, the hidden source beyond all division, what some called the monad. This was not a god among other gods, not a ruler seated inside a universe already made, but the quiet origin from which all things flowed, a reality so complete that it needed nothing and lacked nothing. From that depth, there emanated living expressions of divine being, vast spiritual presences, often called aeons, not created in the harsh mechanical sense, but unfolded, as light unfolds from flame, as meaning unfolds from silence. These aeons emerged in harmonious order, often in pairs, each reflecting something of the abundance from which it came, each carrying a face of divine life, and though one could speak of many, from the outside, they were not chaos, not competing powers, not separate kingdoms. They were one great wholeness, one indivisible field of living fullness, a totality the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness beyond lack, the home before exile. Beyond that fullness was what had not yet been shaped, what still lay outside harmony, a region sometimes imagined as chaos, emptiness, deficiency, the kenoma, not evil in itself, but absence, distance from the living center. And if you pause here, even for a moment, the image is already deeply human, because it speaks not only of the cosmos, but of an inner condition. There is the part of you that remembers fullness, even if only as longing. And there is the part of you that knows emptiness, fragmentation, confusion, and the pain of being cut off from what feels most real. In this old telling, the tragedy begins when one of the aeons, Sophia, whose name means wisdom, reaches beyond the order that sustained the fullness. The traditions describe this in different ways, sometimes as desire, sometimes as solitude, sometimes as an act of will unbalanced by harmony, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of the mystery itself. Wisdom moves, but not in alignment. Wisdom reaches, but not in union. And the result is not another radiant expression of the divine order, but a rupture, a malformed birth, a being severed from its origin and therefore unable to know its own nature. This being is Yaldabaoth. In later retellings, he is fierce, arrogant, malformed, and blind in the deepest sense, not merely unable to see, but unable to perceive the reality beyond himself. Sophia, seeing what has come forth, attempts to hide him away, to cast this broken power out from the luminous order, and in the loneliness of the outer chaos he awakens without context, severed from memory, born from divine substance, but ignorant of divine truth. This is one of the most haunting ideas in the whole myth. A being can possess power and still be blind. A being can emerge from light and yet not know light. A being can mistake isolation for supremacy. Alone in the emptiness, Yaldabaoth beholds no higher throne, no greater source, no wider fullness, and so he concludes that he himself must be the only God. That is how illusion hardens into authority. That is how ignorance, when armed with power, becomes domination. Out of that blindness, he begins to imitate what he dimly carries within him. He emanates children of his own, powers and rulers often called archons, authorities of a lesser order, reflections not of wholeness but of distortion. He attempts to form his own realm, his own echo of fullness, but what emerges is not the living abundance of the pleroma. It is a counterfeit kingdom, constrained, brittle, ruled by hierarchy, force, and arbitrary command. Where the pleroma is radiant and infinite, his dominion is rigid and enclosed. Where fullness flows, his realm traps. Where divine life expands in harmony, his creation hardens into control. From shadow and separation, from a veil cast over the depth, there appears the architecture of the material universe. Space, time, matter, division, form. None of this is presented in the Gnostic imagination as simple evil in the childish sense. It is more unsettling than that. The material world becomes a realm of brilliance mixed with distortion, where beauty and forgetting exist side by side, a realm where something precious is present but hidden, where the visible order can dazzle and imprison at the same time. Yaldabaoth looks upon what he has made and declares himself the only God. In that declaration, the myth turns sharply, because it is no longer only about cosmology. It becomes a drama about false certainty, about the danger of any power that claims total authority while cut off from the fullness beyond itself. Sophia hears the claim and answers him. She names the blindness for what it is. In some traditions, she calls him Samael, the blind god. In others, Socles, the fool. The names matter because they reveal the hidden argument running beneath the whole narrative. What rules the world may not be what it claims to be. What presents itself as final may be partial. What demands obedience may itself be lost. And once that thought enters the mind, it is difficult to set it down again, because it reaches beyond myth and begins to touch experience. How many things in human life ask for loyalty while hiding their emptiness? How many structures are built on fear, repetition, and control, yet speak in the language of order? In the ancient story, Yaldabaoth does not accept correction. Blind power rarely does. Instead, he turns in rage toward the fullness above him. The archons seize or bind portions of divine energy, the exact details shifting from one account to another. But the pattern remains. Something of the higher light becomes entangled in the lower realm. A sacred essence is caught in the machinery of a false order. Sophia sees the consequence of what has happened and repents, not in the narrow moral sense, but in the deeper sense of turning back toward what is true. She descends toward the damage. She seeks to repair what has been fractured. She seeks, in some mysterious way, to reach the being born from her error and to undo the prison forming around the stolen light. And within the pleroma, another presence stirs. The Christ, another aeon, enters the movement of rescue, not as a warrior of crude conquest, but as a bearer of remembrance, a force that moves toward what has been trapped, toward what has forgotten itself, toward what still carries the hidden spark of home. That is where the next movement begins. Because once divine essence is caught inside the material realm, the story is no longer only about the birth of a false world. It becomes a story about you, about memory under pressure, about the spark buried in limitation, and about what happens when a prison is made so beautiful that those inside it no longer realize they are asleep. And once you imagine that possibility, that a prison can be made beautiful enough to feel like home, the story of Adam and Eve changes completely, because it is no longer simply about disobedience, punishment, and exile. It becomes a story about consciousness, about what is hidden inside the human being, and about why awakening is so often mistaken for sin by whatever benefits from your sleep. In the strange and luminous logic of this Gnostic retelling, Yaldabaoth gazes upon his newest creation, the primordial human, sometimes called Adam Kadmon, and sees in it something he did not truly create and cannot fully control. There is a spark within this being, a trace of the higher fullness, a fragment of divine essence that does not belong to the false order of the material world. That spark is the danger. That spark is the threat. Because if the human being remembers what it carries, then the whole structure of domination begins to weaken. The soul no longer confuses the cage for reality. It no longer mistakes the ruler of the cage for the highest God. So before remembrance can unfold, division is introduced. The primordial human is split into two, Adam and Eve, male and female, not merely as biological categories, but as a symbolic fracturing of an original unity. Separation enters the human story at the beginning, and with separation comes the possibility of longing, projection, blame, dependence, and the quiet ache of incompleteness. Yet Yaldabaoth does not begin by tormenting them openly. That would be too obvious. Instead, he gives them something subtler and far more effective, a world pleasant enough to keep them passive. The garden is not pure blessing here, but a beautiful enclosure, a place of comfort without truth, where innocence becomes the mechanism of captivity. This may be one of the most psychologically piercing images in the entire myth, because it suggests that what keeps a being asleep is not always pain. Sometimes what enslaves is not terror, but comfort arranged so carefully that deeper seeing never begins. Into that sealed world, another element appears, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In many religious tellings, this tree is framed primarily as a test, but here it carries a far more dangerous meaning. It is a planted possibility of recognition. It is the opening through which the human being might realize that the ruler of this garden is not what he claims to be. If Adam and Eve eat, they do not simply break a rule, they begin to perceive. And perception is the first movement of liberation. That is why the prohibition matters so much. Yaldabaoth forbids the fruit not because knowledge is poisonous in itself, but because knowledge threatens the entire architecture of ignorance on which his world depends. He tells them they will die if they eat. This is how domination usually speaks. It wraps fear around insight. It warns that looking too closely will destroy you. It calls obedience, safety, and awareness danger. For a time, Adam and Eve listen. And why would they not? They are new to the world, surrounded by beauty, still untested, still sheltered within a system whose cruelty has not yet fully revealed itself. But then the old wisdom returns, not in thunder, not in royal proclamation, but through the figure of the serpent. In this retelling, the serpent is not the enemy of truth. It becomes the voice through which Sophia reaches Eve. The image is startling because it overturns the entire emotional axis of the familiar story. The voice tradition taught people to fear becomes the voice that invites awakening. The figure condemned as deceiver becomes the messenger of a deeper disclosure. Sophia speaks through the serpent and tells Eve that the ruler of the garden has lied, that eating will not bring the death he threatened, but awakening, knowledge, recognition. Eve listens. That matters. She listens not because she is weak, but because some part of her still resonates with what comes from beyond the prison. She eats the fruit, then gives it to Adam, and the result is not collapse into death, but the opening of sight. Their eyes are changed. They know. They understand that they are naked, but nakedness here is more than exposure of the body. It is the loss of illusion. It is the collapse of the dream in which the garden could still be mistaken for innocence. They see that the order around them is not neutral, not ultimate, not holy in the way it pretended to be. They understand that the garden is a controlled space, and that Yaldabaoth is not the source of truth but the manager of ignorance. That moment, psychologically and spiritually, is the true rupture in the story. Once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize the prison, comfort no longer feels innocent. Once the inner spark begins to stir, the world that once soothed you begins to feel strange. Yaldabaoth comes searching for them, and here the myth makes another deliberate incision into the image of the all-knowing creator. He must ask where Adam is. He must call out. He does not know in the perfect way he claimed to know. The ruler of the false world is powerful, but not absolute. He is commanding, but not omniscient. Even this detail serves the same larger movement of reversal. The being who demanded unquestioned obedience is shown to be limited, reactive, and insecure. Adam responds not with heroic clarity, but with fear. He confesses and shifts the burden onto Eve. That too is deeply human. The moment truth breaks into an unconscious structure, blame often follows before courage does. Fracture moves inward, shame enters the relationship. The awakening does not instantly make them free. It first makes visible how much distortion already lives in them. Eve, in some versions of the myth, reaches upward, attempting escape, turning toward the pleroma, toward the lost home beyond matter. But the system closes around her. The archons intervene. The story darkens here in a way that is not meant to be consumed as spectacle, but felt as revelation about the violence of domination once its authority is challenged. Eve is violated, humiliated, forced back beneath the weight of a world that cannot tolerate her refusal. Yaldabaoth curses women into subservience and drives Adam and Eve from the garden. What follows is not merely expulsion from paradise, but entry into history under distortion. The human condition becomes marked by labor, fear, hierarchy, sexual injury, blame, appeasement, and the desperate attempt to survive inside a reality ruled by a power both hungry and unstable. The myth then pushes deeper into territory that feels shocking, precisely because it makes visible what more polished narratives often hide. Eve is said in some versions to bear Cain through contact with one of the archons, while Abel is born later through Adam. Whether one reads that literally, symbolically, or as the residue of conflicting traditions, the emotional function is clear. Violence enters the lineage almost immediately. What has been damaged at the level of cosmology now reproduces itself through bloodline, family, and social order. Adam and Eve, already fearful of what happens when Yaldabaoth is defied, begin to placate him. They worship. They offer sacrifice. This is another profound psychological turn in the story. because it shows how easily beings trapped in an unjust system learn to perform devotion not from love, but from terror. Appeasement becomes religion. Compliance becomes survival. Cain and Abel grow up under that shadow. One works the earth, the other offers livestock. When their sacrifices are presented, Abel's is favored and Cain's is not. The reason given in this retelling is chilling in its bluntness. Grain does not suffer when it dies, but an animal does. Pain is what pleases the false ruler. Suffering is rendered sacred by a power that feeds on submission. Cain absorbs the lesson. If suffering is what is honored, then perhaps a greater offering must contain more of it. He kills his brother. And Yaldabaoth, far from condemning the act with holy grief, responds with a strange and twisted approval, marking Cain in a way that sets him apart and protects him. The message beneath the event is severe. Under distorted rulership, violence does not disrupt the order. It reveals it. Adam and Eve are horrified. They cast Cain away and begin again, bringing forth Seth and Noria. And here a new current enters the myth, quieter at first, but filled with another possibility. Seth becomes associated with a lineage through which humanity continues, but Noria carries a more elusive charge. The traditions differ about her. Some imagine her as connected with Seth in repopulating the earth. Others hold her apart, untouched, difficult to contain inside ordinary genealogy. Yet through those variations, one image persists. Noria is not merely another child inside the broken world. She is linked to Sophia. She bears, in some hidden way, a memory stronger than the structure around her. She belongs to the same drama of descent and awakening, and even before her fuller role unfolds, her presence changes the emotional direction of the story. Until this point, the pattern has been enclosure, fear, distortion, submission, and blood. With Noria, something else begins to tremble at the edge of the narrative. Not escape yet, not victory, but the possibility that what entered the prison can still remember the way out. And once that possibility appears, however faintly, the story can no longer remain only a tale of corruption, because the presence of memory inside the prison changes everything. Humanity continues through the line of Seth, spreading across the earth, multiplying, building life beneath a sky still ruled by powers that feed on ignorance. And for a time there is a fragile sense of order, the kind of order that often settles over a wounded world before the next fracture opens. Yet, in the Gnostic imagination, peace inside a distorted system is never entirely secure, because anything that grows too stable risks remembering itself. So Yaldabaoth sends new agents into the world, powers known in overlapping traditions as the Watchers, archonic beings who descend into the human realm not to heal it, but to contaminate it further, to deepen confusion, to bind the human story more tightly to violence, appetite, and domination. They take human women, and from these unions come the Nephilim, giants born from collision between realms, beings of immense force whose existence itself signals that the borders of creation have been violated. At first they consume what humanity depends on, then they begin to consume humanity itself. Around them spreads a new corruption, not only of body but of culture. Forbidden arts, weapons, greed, manipulative knowledge, technologies of power without wisdom, all of it enters human life more deeply, and the earth becomes a theater of escalating brutality. This part of the myth is not only trying to explain strange beings or ancient catastrophe, it is offering an image of what happens whenever power descends without conscience and teaches people how to expand control faster than they expand awareness. Civilization advances outward while collapsing inward. Knowledge grows, but not understanding. Ability grows, but not depth. And as always in this story, the world becomes more efficient at reproducing the very things that wound it. Yaldabaoth delights in the result. That detail matters. The ruler of the false world is not merely careless, he is entertained by ruin. The spectacle of beings turning against one another, feeding on fear, and building systems of suffering becomes part of the logic of his dominion. Yet even here, the myth refuses to seal itself inside despair. Other powers see what is happening. In some versions, they are lesser aeons. In others, angelic beings who have turned toward the higher light. But however the names shift, the pattern remains. Compassion still moves. Rescue is still possible. Four beings come forward: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and a fourth presence who in some traditions resembles Uriel, while in certain Gnostic currents, another figure, Elileth, takes that place. They ask to descend. They are permitted. And the old story of helpless captivity gives way, for a moment, to intervention. The battles that follow are not only cosmic combat in the fantasy sense, they dramatize an inner truth as well. Forces that preserve consciousness and integrity must eventually confront the structures that profit from confusion. Raphael and Michael move against the Watchers. Gabriel turns toward the Nephilim. Elileth remains near another thread of the story because Noria is still present, still hidden, still carrying a role that is not yet fully opened. As the destructive powers are struck down, Yaldabaoth responds in the way false authority often responds when it cannot maintain control through manipulation. It turns to obliteration. If the game cannot continue on his terms, then he will drown the board. So the flood is unleashed, not as a serene moral cleansing from an unquestionably righteous source, but as a rage-filled act of domination, a catastrophic reset driven by a ruler who would rather destroy the world than risk losing it. Even Noah, in this version, is not simply placed inside a clean tale of obedience. He is chosen as a survival vessel for the continuation of embodied life, because the larger stalemate depends on humanity remaining within the material order. And then Noria returns to the center of the myth with astonishing force. She approaches the ark and asks to be led aboard, having perceived what is coming, but Noah refuses her. In another telling, this would be a footnote. Here it becomes a revelation. Noria breathes fire and destroys the ark. The gesture is unforgettable because it shatters the passive image so often assigned to sacred femininity. She acts. She refuses exclusion. She burns what denies her. The archons come for her, threatening the same violence that had once been directed toward Eve, and suddenly the myth draws a line between generations. What was done to one woman in silence will not be repeated in the same way with another. Noria fights back. Elileth appears beside her. The archons are driven away. And then the story enters one of its most luminous moments. Noria is lifted from the earth and carried upward. As she rises, Elileth reveals to her the hidden architecture of the cosmos, the fall of Sophia, the deception of Yaldabaoth, the entrapment of divine essence, the true condition of the world beneath appearances. This is not presented merely as information. It is gnosis, the awakening knowledge that is not separate from transformation. To know in this sense is to become capable of ascent. To remember is to loosen the grip of the prison. To see clearly is already to begin leaving. Noria can ascend because she has recognized what she is. She is not merely a creature of the lower world. She carries within herself a relation to Sophia, to the higher wisdom, to the fullness before fragmentation. When she returns to the pleroma, she is not entering a foreign place. She is rejoining a truth that had always been nearer than the world allowed her to remember. This is why the story still speaks with such strange intensity to people who encounter it now. It does not ask only whether there are hidden beings above the stars. It asks whether something in you has been living beneath your own awareness, waiting for the moment when the explanation for your unease finally becomes visible. It asks whether the world has trained you to confuse adaptation with freedom. It asks whether your exhaustion, your suspicion, your recurring sense that something essential has been misplaced may not be signs of failure, but traces of buried memory. As Noria returns, even one of Yaldabaoth's own powers, Sabaoth, sees and understands. He realizes he has served a lie. He repents and is forgiven, then receives rule in a higher order. Even within the machinery of distortion, the possibility of turning remains. Meanwhile, the flood goes forward. Noah rebuilds. The waters fall for 40 days and 40 nights. The old world is swallowed, and those inside the ark survive upon a mountain. But the resolution is not simple triumph. What follows is closer to a cosmic standstill, a cold covenant between realms. Yaldabaoth will not flood the earth again, so long as the fullness above does not invade directly. Why such an uneasy balance? Because the central conflict has become more subtle than war. Billions of sparks of divine essence remain entangled in embodied life. They cannot awaken without minds, without human experience, without the friction and limitation through which recognition becomes possible. Yet, Yaldabaoth also depends on those embodied lives. He needs souls inside matter in order to bind, distract, manipulate, and wound them. If the higher realm destroys the lower world outright, the sparks remain unawakened. If Yaldabaoth annihilates embodied life entirely, he loses the very field in which his power operates. So history continues in tension. That is one of the most unsettling and psychologically rich ideas in the myth. The world persists not because everything is resolved, but because the struggle itself has become the condition in which awakening remains possible. Noah's descendants spread again across the earth, and one might imagine that after such terror they would live in perfect submission, but the story refuses that simplicity. They immediately begin trying to rise, building a tower, reaching upward with the old human impulse to break the imposed ceiling. The languages are confused, the peoples are scattered, nations form. The fractured world takes on the shapes we now recognize as history. Then the myth races forward through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Egypt. Not to retell every detail with equal weight, but to show that the same pattern remains active beneath changing faces. Promises entangled with fear, chosenness mixed with manipulation, blessing shadowed by jealousy, sacrifice demanded to prove loyalty, deception woven into inheritance, exile and power moving side by side. The names change, the settings change, the costumes of history change, but the deeper tension remains. What governs the visible order still presents itself as ultimate. Human beings still negotiate, appease, obey, resist, betray, hope, and suffer inside a world whose surface is never the whole truth. And that may be why this old myth refuses to die. Not because it offers a neat doctrine, and not because it can be used to win an argument, but because it names a feeling many people carry without language. That life in this world often feels like participation in something both beautiful and broken, intimate and estranging, full of wonder yet threaded through with structures that seem to reward sleep more than awareness. The Gnostic story does not force a conclusion. It opens a mirror. It suggests, quietly but relentlessly, that the garden may not have been what it claimed to be, that the ruler of the world may not be the highest source, that suffering may reproduce itself through systems mistaken for holiness, and that within the human being there may remain a spark older than fear, older than conformity, older than the identities handed down by the world. If that is even partly true, then the most important event is not somewhere far away in mythic time. It is the moment recognition begins, when the prison no longer feels complete and memory becomes stronger than habit. And once that begins, the story is no longer only about creation, the flood, or ancient names preserved in secret texts. It becomes the story of what happens when a buried light, however small, refuses to forget itself. And so what remains is the sense that something older than fear was never fully lost. What you have just passed through is a story of concealment and awakening, of false power and hidden light, of exile, struggle, and the faint but enduring trace of something within the human being that was never fully lost. To me, that is what makes this vision so powerful. It does not merely retell an ancient myth, it turns the whole journey inward and makes the search feel personal, intimate, and strangely alive. I would love to know how this story felt to you, what parts stayed with you most, and whether it opened any new thoughts in you. If one line captures your feeling, you can comment something like, "The spark remembers." If this resonated with you, leave a like. Subscribe so we can keep exploring more hidden and fascinating ideas together. And thank you for watching and for being here.